evening. My name is Lauren West. I work here in the Education and the Exhibits Department. We're really excited to have with us tonight Zach, who's here to talk about Sasquatch, who doesn't love hearing about Bigfoot. So I'm going to pass the microphone off to Allison Carter. She's an assistant professor of anthropology here at the U of O, and she will introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much, and thank you all so much for coming. We're really excited to have Zachary Throckmorton here today to talk about science, pseudoscience, and Sasquatch. And Dr. Throckmorton got his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I also got my PhD. We are old graduate school classmates. He's actually an evolutionary anthropologist, but he's also an associate professor of anatomy at the Arkansas College of Osteopathic Medicine. And he has an honorary fellowship at UW-Madison and the University of the Wits. He's going to have to correct my pronunciation, of Evolutionary Studies Institute in Johannesburg, South Africa. When he's not studying Bigfoot, he actually is researching the evolution of the human foot and ankle, and he is a member of the Rising Star team that's been researching this new hominin species called hominins that you might have heard about. And earlier today, he gave this really wonderful presentation on that research. On his research of hominins, and I'm sure would be willing to answer questions about that at the end of this lecture as well too. He's published in numerous locations, doing a lot of open access research, so if you're interested in this kind of work, you're able to go online and find many of his publications. And today he's going to talk about this side research that he's been doing, our side interest in Bigfoot and Sasquatch. So really pleased to welcome him here to Eugene to give this talk, and please join me in welcoming him, and I'll hand the microphone over.
Hello? Yeah, there we go. Has to go real close to the mouth. Sorry, I'm used to the mic that clips onto the tie, and I just kind of roll with it. It feels a little weird holding this microphone. It's like I'm a rapper or something. I'm very pleased to be here. I appreciate y'all taking time out of your evening, taking your free time to hear what I have to say about Bigfoot. My interest in Bigfoot and Sasquatch is derived primarily from my academic research in evolutionary anatomy and the evolution of the human foot and ankle joint. And so that lends itself pretty naturally, I think, to being interested in Sasquatch. And one of the reasons why I became an anthropologist is because I'm fascinated by the great apes, our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees, the bonobos, the gorillas, the orangutans, maybe Bigfoot. And so it's very nice to be able to share that interest with you guys here in maybe Bigfoot's homeland in the great Pacific Northwest. And the older I get and the more places around the world that I visit and I live, the more I come to appreciate certain places a lot more than others. And y'all are fortunate to live up in the Pacific Northwest because, man, it is beautiful up here. And if I were a bipedal hominid or hominoid, I'd be picking this area to live too. So with that said, who lives here? Yes. Yeah, I mean, you show a picture of gray skies, a lake, and a dilapidated castle, and it's automatically, that's where the Loch Ness Monster lives. I think it's really quite striking that these creatures like Bigfoot and Sasquatch, Yetis, the Loch Ness Monster, are such important parts of our shared cultural experience and our heritage as humans. We've got these things all throughout the world. All sorts of different cultures have their own types of hidden or unknown or potentially existing creatures. Back where Dr. Carter and I did our doctorates, I don't know, have any of you ever heard of the hodag of the North Woods of Wisconsin?
Yeah.
Yeah. The ski area up here, whose symbol is the hodag. All right, great, yeah. So the hodag is a little less well known than the Loch Ness Monster. It's certainly Sasquatch. But if you're in Wisconsin and you've been drinking a lot of beer all winter, this is the type of creature that you come up with. And one of the things that's interesting about all these hidden creatures is that some are a lot more plausible from the perspective of a zoologist than others. And the plausibility scale, this rate's about a -3. But it's certainly, it's an interesting part of the local Wisconsin folklore. another beautiful forest in the United States, North America. And it's cool to see, this is the Rhinelander, Wisconsin. The mascot for their high school is the Hodags. I had a student in my class who's like, have you ever heard about the Hodag? Why no, tell me more. So that was neat to learn about that when I was there. I now live in central western Arkansas, which is a beautiful part of the country. We have lots of nice forests, some old mountains that are falling apart and getting a little small these days, but still wonderful hiking. And that's if you are not accosted by the Ozark howler, which, as you can see from this terrible photograph, is the product of about 15 minutes worth of Photoshop. The Ozark howler is supposed to be this kind of devil dog. There's these creatures that have the common theme of being associated with the devil of some sort, like the Mothman of New Jersey, and there's other sorts of glowing red-eyed animals in different parts of the country and different parts of the world. And the Ozark howler is supposed to be kind of this dog-canid type creature that has demonic horns and a sharp tail. And it's just amazing that the person who took this photograph has got a camera phone that's about 15 years old from the quality of that. And again, this is one of those creatures that is probably not likely to actually exist and is more important from a perspective of folklore. And of course, we get much more well-known hidden animals. I don't know if you guys make fun of people from California because it's the state to your south. Where I'm from, Michigan, we make fun of people in Ohio because they're south of us. We have the Yetis coming from the Himalaya mountains, so they're very common in the folklore of Tibet and Nepal, Mongolia, China, even into northern India, Pakistan. And you can go down to Disneyland in California and see this aggressive and hostile Yeti. And there's an Expedition Everest now in Disney World where you also get attacked by a Yeti. It's a very cool ride. And the neat part of this experience at Disney World is that the waiting area, where you snake through the lines, actually has a lot of really interesting information about Yetis and Sasquatches and lots of purported artifacts that belong to them, books about them, and so you can learn a lot about the study of these animals waiting in line for this roller coaster. And then there's more recent pop cultural depictions of friendlier Yetis. Anybody know what movie this is? Yeah, this is Monsters Inc., right. So the abominable snowman in Monsters Inc. likes to make snow cones, and they're lemon flavored. They're not yellow because they're the yellow snow. And of course, here in North America, we have our own bipedal hominoid, otherwise known as the Bigfoot or the Sasquatch. What we are talking about are creatures that fall into the purview of a discipline called cryptozoology. So crypt is a prefix that just means hidden, and zoology is the study of animals. So cryptozoology is the study of hidden animals, animals that are less well known to science. There's chairs right across from each other on the aisle. Yeah, cool. And there are two basic types of cryptozoology. There's the search for animals that are known from the fossil record, but we think are probably extinct. And then there's the search for animals that are not formally described by science, but we have reason to believe that they exist because of anecdotes, because of myths, because of folklore. So I'll be talking primarily about the latter, but we're going to talk a little bit about the former also. This is so nice to see have a crowd here that is a little bit more likely to understand my cultural references than first and second year undergrads that I referred to earlier today who did not recognize this. Oh man. But I think before we start discussing these different types of cryptids, these hidden animals in cryptozoology, it's important to get an idea of what science is. And science is a course that you take when you're in kindergarten through 12th grade, and if you go to college, you continue to do science. But science is an active, dynamic process. It's not necessarily a body of knowledge. It's a way of understanding the world, and it's a way in which we can try to frame our place in the world and how we interact with reality. Science is a critical reputational process, and I don't know if any of y'all are students here at the University of Oregon or are going through some of your studies. One of the things that you find is that the more and more you do in terms of scientific studies and scientific research, the more people tell you that you're not doing it correctly. And it's a critical process, and by criticizing and winnowing out what is not true, we get closer to what is true. But of course, we're talking about truth with a little t. We look for facts in science. We do not look for truth with a big T. And this great line from Indiana Jones, who is in all shapes and ways not a good archaeologist. This is one thing that he says in the movies that absolutely is accurate. Archaeology is the search for fact, not truth. If it's truth you're looking for, Dr. Terry's philosophy class is right down the hall. The philosophers come up with truth. People who study religion come up with truth. Scientists don't. We come up with facts, and then we try to explain those facts with ideas that explain the hypotheses. The hallmarks of science are reproducibility. I can describe a set of observations or an experimental pattern or method to anybody else, and if they have a reasonable amount of training, they should be able to come up with the exact same experimental design, perform it themselves, and come up with hopefully the same answers I did, same method, same results I did. Intersubjective verifiability is the really long-winded, jargony way of saying that we can all look at a fact and agree that it is true, that we can verify that between each other. So you ask, what color is the sky? Well, it's blue. Well, how do you know that? Well, we know that light is a series of different wavelengths of electromagnetic waves and stuff. Physics was a really long time ago for me now. And the wavelength between certain frequencies, that's what we call blue. And we can all agree that that is in fact accurate. You know, that wall is, kind of an offish white. This is something that everybody is going to agree on. It's not subject to opinions. It is a fact. And then finally, Karl Popper, who is a very important philosopher of science, emphasized the importance of what he called the rejectable hypothesis, the hypothesis that can be proven to be wrong. If you are not generating a hypothesis that can be proven to be wrong, you are not doing science. And generally what we try to do is we come up with hypotheses that we are fairly confident are not going to be proven wrong. But if you don't ask a question that can be shown to be inaccurate, then you're not doing science. Pseudoscience, on the other hand, the prefix pseudo just means false. And pseudoscience is a way of trying to look at the world in a way that has some of the trappings of superficial similarity to science, but it relies on experiments that are not reproducible. It relies on observations that aren't verifiable. And in science, one of the things in my field of evolutionary anatomy that's become very important over the last few decades is openness of data and accessibility of data, so that people can look at what you're doing and agree that you are interpreting it correctly. And so there's been serious problems in the field of paleoanthropology that I work in over the last few decades of people not sharing their data. It gets to the point where some of these researchers who find these exciting hominid fossils, they don't share it with anybody. They're not even doing science, because if you can't share it with the world, it doesn't really exist. If I can't look at a famous foot bone from Asia, is it even real? I have no way of verifying anything that people say about it. And in society, in general, I think it highlights the importance of a free media, that an idea is transmitted out into our society, it is accessible to people, and then they can independently work to verify that, or just accept it as true because it is from a trusted source. Pseudoscience is working with observations that just aren't verifiable. That, you go and you say one thing and there's no way to tell whether or not it's correct. And then finally, pseudoscience tends to rely on hypotheses that are not testable. And these start to get into the realm of different types of conspiracy theories. I was very heartened that at least 2 students from who were born in the year 2000 were aware of the greatest film ever made. This is, of course, Ghostbusters, where Dr. Peter Venkman, who holds degrees in both psychology and parapsychology, is conducting experiments on ESP, or extrasensory perception. And so he's working with these two undergrads and asking them what is the symbol on the card, and they're trying to read his mind. They're trying to use their special extrasensory perception. And of course, it's all common. I mean, he's not showing them, he's just saying, wow, you're right, and then puts the card back down so that they have no idea what's really going on. So some of the criticisms of cryptozoology include the fact that it tends to be heavily confirmational rather than refutational. In other words, we have confirmed that we have found this rather than we have constructed hypotheses that can be refuted. Cryptozoology generally suffers from a lack of physical empirical evidence, and if there's not evidence to be considered, you can't reproduce it. There's tends to be a reliance on anecdotal evidence that is provided by untrained observers, also not verifiable, and so most mainstream scientists dismiss cryptozoology as pseudoscience. But the thing is that cryptozoology, when it's done correctly, can be a legitimate science, and it can be done scientifically with rigor, and papers can be peer-reviewed by the scientific community. And so some cryptozoologists are trained experts. In other words, if the evidence is real, it can be verified by people who know what they're doing. And experts have exposed a lot of different types of false evidence and hoaxes, which is a form of reputation. So cryptozoology is not always, but it can be legitimate science. The problem is we don't have a lot of unequivocal physical evidence for a lot of these different types of animals, but I think we have a lot of reasons to keep looking. Anybody know what that is? This is a coelacanth. Yeah, this is a type of bony fish that lives in lots of different parts of the world. But in 1938, a living specimen was caught off the coast of South Africa, to the astonishment of a lot of paleontologists who believed that the coelacanth had gone extinct 65 million years ago, about the same time that dinosaurs went extinct. Interestingly enough, if you go to South Africa and you actually talk to native South Africans, they will tell you that the meat of this fish tastes like garbage, but that its skin and its scales are extremely durable and tough, and it's great for patching up holes in tarps and tires and things like that. So here we are as Western scientists being astonished that, oh my goodness, look, this thing is still alive, when we could have just gone down to the local fish market and been like, hey, where'd you get that? Tell me about it. And that highlights the recognition that you don't need to be a practitioner of Western scientific methodologies as a professional to have knowledge about the real world and the natural world, and to be able to use that knowledge. This is the first photograph of a living giant squid. It was not photographed until 2004, so that's not that long ago. Before then, the only thing we had from giant squids were dead bodies, and mostly parts of dead bodies, because squids are full of ammonia and other nasty chemicals, and they tend to degrade and decay really quickly when they wash on shore. But the thing that became very useful in terms of the studies on the giant squids were not necessarily these photographs, but that straight white line that's in the lower left-hand corner of that picture is actually a fishing line. And so sometimes these giant squids will get their parts of the tentacles entwined in those lines, and then they are brought back onto the ship. And then you can take that physical evidence and go do some DNA analysis on it and find out that the DNA of this animal is like other squids, but it is unique. It is not matching the profiles of other squids that we've already studied extensively.
How giant was it?
Giant squids, so squids have two primary grasping tentacles that are really long, and the largest giant squids, I believe, have the tip of the body down to the tip of the longer tentacles are about 60 to 70 feet, if I remember right. So you could get one in this room, barely. And these are big animals. Oftentimes, when sperm whales die, people will do necropsies on them, and their bellies will be filled with the beaks of giant squids. So squids have a very hard beak that is in the middle of their body that they use to eat. It's not unlike the beak of a parrot or a bird, and it is not digestible by a whale's digestive system. So sometimes sperm whales will be found that are dead, and they'll cut them apart, and the bellies will be filled with the beaks of all the squids that they've eaten previously. The beak of a giant squid is large enough to easily take your forearm off in one bite. So this is not a creature that you want to encounter in the open ocean, unless you're with your friendly sperm whale and it eats it for you. The mountain gorilla was not described by science until 1902, and you're like, okay, well that was in the early 1900s, but this is an ape. I mean, this is one of our closest living relatives. This is an important mammal. Not that, well, yeah, some mammals I guess are more important to an anthropologist than others. And it's fascinating because again we had stories of the existence of these creatures, but we didn't really have a formal understanding of them until relatively recently. And I think this shows that, there's still a lot of the world that we don't have a very good handle on, that we are not very familiar with, that we have not explored thoroughly. All of the great apes, including gorillas, are endangered. And so the discovery of over 100,000 gorillas hanging out in the forests of the Democratic Republic of Congo a decade ago was wonderful. We were just shocked, like, wow, where'd all these gorillas come from? But it's great that we have that many more gorillas living in that part of Central West Africa. The mother lode of gorillas. And then in 2014, I had the opportunity and the privilege of being part of the international scientific research team that published a previously unknown species of the genus Homo to the world. Other people who are smaller than I am and can fit into a small cave where these were found, recovered 1,500 fossils, which is the largest haul of human ancestor or human relative fossils in Africa. And we got together and we described all of the anatomy, and this was a completely unanticipated member of our own genus. And we now have reason to believe that it lived up until about 250,000 years ago. Our entire lineage is maybe 6 million years old. So this is really close to us. It is not close to the beginning of the earliest recognizably kind of human-looking things. Excuse me real quick. I wish that were a beer. We went to Oakshire last night, and they have some very, very tasty beers that were also very strong. Getting through all three of these talks today. So we're finding things like giant squids, like the coelacanth, like Homo naledi. And Homo naledi was not the only member of the genus Homo that has been uncovered and discovered in recent times. When I was a first-year graduate student, the hobbit, or Homo floresiensis, was first described. And this is a very small-brained, you can see on the left, that is the skull of Homo floresiensis compared to a typical modern human on the right. They had small brains, they were maybe 3.5, 4 feet tall. And we have evidence suggesting that these guys were living in Southeast Asia until as recently as 50,000 years ago. 50,000 years, for those of you who are familiar with human archaeology, is pretty recent. There were people in other parts of the planet at this time who were behaving very much like we do today, who look very much like we do today. So the fact that we've got this weird, strange, very small-brained, small-bodied, small-brained human running around at the same time as people who look a lot more like us, I think is pretty wild. And interestingly enough, to this day in Sumatra, people who are Sumatrans tell stories about the orang pendek. That name orang is probably familiar because you've heard of the orangutan. That word orang just means person, and pendek is mischief. This is the mischievous person. This is a wild, hairy person that lives in the woods and comes into the village to steal your food and move stuff around. And so people in Sumatra to this day tell these stories and have these folk tales about the orang pendek that look and sound a whole lot like they might be based on an extinct species of human that lived 50,000 years ago. And so I think that that's testament to the potential power and survivability of oral traditions and the type of folk tales and myths and lore that all human societies have. And of course, getting back closer to home, Native Americans of the Pacific Northwest, many of them have stories and have have, as part of their important cultural heritage and folklore, legends about creatures that we call today Bigfoot or Sasquatch. The Tsimshian of British Columbia have what they call the Baush, the Kwakiutl, just north of here have the Bukwoos. If you ever have a chance to go up to Whistler in British Columbia, you can visit the Lilwak Cultural Center. It's a wonderful place. I strongly recommend it. It's very informative. It's a really well done museum, and they have outstanding salmon chili. So stop by the cafeteria and try that out. And you can learn all sorts of interesting things there, but they have specific displays about the Baush and the Bukwoos, and they have a rich art history of creating masks that they incorporate into different types of rituals and behaviors. And the masks look really ape-like. They have prominent brows, they have deep-set eyes, they're all super hairy, they all have big ears, and these things look like apes. They don't look as much like humans, they look more like apes, and that's very odd considering that the only primates that live in North America are humans. There have been no other primates in this continent for a really long period of time. And so there are no apes native to North America. All of the primates that live in the Americas live in Central and South America. So where on earth are Native Americans getting these depictions of Bigfoot and Sasquatch? Where would they have picked up this idea that there were these things living in this part of the world? And I think that it's plausible that if there were such thing as Bigfoot or Sasquatch, they probably came from the same place that Native Americans did, and that's Asia. There's a really nice display here in this museum about the peopling of Americas. I have been informed that in this museum, humans did not come across over the Bering Land Bridge. They instead took a coastal route and were using boats to get through. These are the types of details that we like to argue about as scientists. I don't have a horse in this race, so as out of respect to my host, that's great. That's certainly plausible for Native Americans coming to the New World using primarily boats and working the coast. I think it's less likely that Bigfoot was using boats because other apes, as bright and as smart as they are, do not build seafaring vessels. And so that we know as Gigantopithecus. That suffix pithecus, or pithecoid, refers to primates, and giganto means it's really big. That's how big we think it is. Gigantopithecus lived in North Asia from about 1 million years ago. Those are the oldest Gigantopithecus fossils. It's possible they lived earlier than that. We just don't have any evidence for it. And they seem to disappear from the fossil record by about 300,000 years ago. We only know about Gigantopithecus from their teeth and from their jaws. We don't have a really good fossil record about them, but we know they were primates because mammalian teeth are extremely highly diagnostic. If you're going to find any part of a mammal, you hope to find its teeth because that's usually what we use to nail down species in mammals. And we know that these things were probably about 10 feet tall. They probably weighed over 1,000 pounds. And the biggest gorillas that ever lived in zoos long ago when they got all overfed and overweight and sedentary were probably 500-600 pounds. So these are probably twice as heavy as the biggest gorillas that have ever lived. And that's artist Bill Munn, who created a Gigantopithecus. And you might be more familiar with Gigantopithecus because Gigantopithecus was that's King Louie from the most recent Jungle Book film. King Louie was portrayed as the Gigantopithecus and voiced by Christopher Walken. Even Gigantopithecus is now getting into pop culture, which is great. We have some reason to think that Gigantopithecus might have been hunted to extinction by Homo erectus. We don't have direct evidence of, say, like butchery marks on Gigantopithecus bones. But generally speaking, when humans show up in parts of the world, other large mammals tend to stop making a go of it. That seems to be a defining character of our species. Sorry, but did I turn it off? Okay, all right.
If you bump the bottom of it, it mutes it. So don't do that.
My my students would be telling me, man, I wish he had this mic and muted himself in class. So, it's possible that the descendants of Gigantopithecus, like Bigfoot, might have been able to cross Beringia and came across the Bering Land Bridge either at the same time as Native Americans, or potentially earlier in time because there was an ice-free corridor, for example, slightly more than 35,000 years ago. So it's possible that the descendants of Gigantopithecus could have shown up in the New World or North America before humans did. These are all hypotheses. If this creature is real, how did it get there? What are its geographic origins? What are its biological origins? These are all testable hypotheses. They require assumptions and they require evidence. So I want to talk about a bunch of different types of biological evidence. This is from the golden age of The Simpsons. This is the episode Call of the Simpsons where Homer gets lost driving the RV and has a go of trying to make it in the woods. So Bigfoot diet, pork chops aplenty. At the end of the episode, they say that he is either a brilliant beast or a below average intelligence human, so Marge endearingly calls Homer her brilliant beast moving forward. That episode is probably available on Netflix or Hulu, again called The Simpsons, pitching one of my favorite episodes of one of my favorite TV shows. But this is the classic and iconic Patterson-Gimlin film that was unveiled to the world in the late 1960s. You have seen this video, but you've seen probably the version that instead of moving the frame around a Bigfoot jerks around and is moving inside of the frame instead. So it's really hard to see the original film because it's all shaky and jittery. But this is a re-edit of it where they move the frame and keep Bigfoot straight. So that is supposed to be a film of Bigfoot walking around in Northern California. And this film has been the subject of so many different documentaries, so many different books, magazine articles. I mean, this is a part of American cultural history. This is an important part of who we are as Americans. Everyone in the United States has probably seen this. It's very interesting to consider whether this video or whether this film is real because of the way that humans walk. And humans walk with what we call a non-compliant gait. And so when you are walking and you put your heel down every time you take a step, your legs get locked into place. And that is an important way to save energy as you walk forward. When apes walk, and they walk bipedally, they tend to walk with what is called a compliant gait, where they bend at their hips, and they bend at their knees, and they go forward like this. And so you can distinguish a human gait from an ape-like gait just by the way that they walk. And the giveaway here is the vertical oscillation of the human. Our heads go up and down as we walk. You actually have a dedicated part of the back of your brain that is responsible for keeping your visual image locked onto the same point so that your vision isn't going up and down constantly as you walk. So even to the point of neuroanatomy, we are adapted to being able to walk like this, which implies we've been doing it for a very long time. When experts were asked to consider this, you got the entire range. John Napier, who's a great primatologist, little doubt that it's a hoax. Different renowned anatomist and primatologist. Yeah, but it's not typical of any type of human gait. This would have been difficult to fake. Or in 1967, you could not have faked this because we did not understand how humans and apes walk well enough to even fake it. And then my favorite, uncertainties in subject and camera positions doom quantitative analysis, which is the professor's jargon way of saying, and there have been many people who have confessed to being the person in the suit. And so there were, as early as the late 60s, just a few years after this was taken, people saying, yeah, that was me. And in the episode called The Simpsons, they have to stop filming because the guy left his watch on, so he's got to take his watch off and go back and do it again. There have been people who have confessed to this on their deathbeds, and it's very difficult to verify any of the potential legitimacy of this film. And I think it's a good exercise in critical consideration of evidence. I tend to think that that looks pretty real. But the problem is, how convincing is this? I don't know. I'm more skeptical about that. We have lots and lots of footprints, and here you can see a gentleman who, if I remember right, either lives in Northern California or Southern Oregon, where you can stop by the Bigfoot roadside attractions and buy the fake Bigfoot footprints, and then you put them on your own feet. You go walking around in your own woods, and you tell your kids that Bigfoot's been here. Some of these footprints are really easy to refute because they don't look real. And so someone like me who has spent a ridiculous amount of time studying the anatomy of feet in humans and in extinct types of humans and in apes will tell you that when humans walk, there's a lot of variation in how deep the footprint is. Generally speaking, the heel is going to be very deep because when you initially put your heel down, it digs into the ground because it's got your body weight in it. The medial part, the inside part of your foot where your big toe is, tends to push into the ground deeper. The lateral toes, the pinky toes, oftentimes don't even leave an impression at all because you are not putting much weight on the lateral part of your foot. The ball of your foot, where your toes are attached to the rest of your foot, tends to get depressed fairly deep into the soil because at one point in the walking cycle, you have a lot of pressure on the ball of your foot. So we can look at footprints like this and see that the lateral toes are as deep as the medial toes, which is not how people generally walk. There is no variation in depth from the heel to the middle of the foot to the ball of the foot. And one thing that you very rarely see in humans is the proximal or the base of the toes don't push into the ground very much. It's usually the distal part, the tip towards the tips of the toes that push into the ground a lot. This right here is a very unsophisticated fake. It just does not hold up. Everything that can be wrong about this footprint is wrong. Then you get things like this, and you gotta look at it and go, okay, well, this is interesting. And I have right here, hypothesis testing and TMT versus MTP flexibility. There are two different important joints in your foot, the tarso-metatarsal joints, where the back of your foot touches the middle of your foot, and then where the middle of the foot touches the toes. Those are the tarso-metatarsal and metatarsophalangeal joints. And in humans, the tarso-metatarsal joint is supposed to be very rigid. It should not move much at all. There are a lot of different types of disorders and disease conditions, pathologies, where that tarso-metatarsal joint will move, but you generally need to go see a doctor to get them to fix that because it causes a lot of problems when you try to walk a lot. That's what is called the mid-tarsal break, and that is a ape character. That is not a human character. Now, my buddy Jerry, who is one of the other 3 people in the world who does what I do, did a really nice study a few years ago demonstrating that there's a small frequency of people, about 5%, that have a very, very subtle, very small tarso-metatarsal joint, mid-tarsal break. But what he found was that it's very difficult to find it on anything other than what's called a force plate, which is a device that is designed to pick up very small changes in the amount of force that different parts of your feet deliver into the ground while you walk. Whereas apes have mid-tarsal breaks that you can see in sand. And so you look at a footprint like this, the heel is deeper than the midfoot, and then there's a raised ridge in the middle that doesn't really look like a human. So from that perspective, this footprint does not look very human-like, and it's certainly not a chimpanzee or a gorilla or any of the other apes. And, well, it was found here in the Pacific Northwest. They think, well, this had to have been Bigfoot. But when you look at it further, the lateral toes are pushed into the soil almost as deeply as the medial toes, and that is very weird. There are not animals that do that. Apes do not do that. We do not do that. And so this footprint is difficult to refute because it's either a sophisticated fake or it's not fake. But the problem is, you ask the person who took this picture, where did you find it? And they don't quite recall the exact location. Do you have pictures of other footprints from this series? Because generally animals don't put one foot in the ground and then stand there for 3 years. They continue to walk forward. So where are the rest of the prints from this trackway? Well, it was covered up in leaves and stuff like that. And then you start to get a little bit more skeptical that, yeah, I don't know about this. Again, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and this one lone footprint by itself is intriguing, but it is probably not adequate. And footprints are incredibly important in the understanding of human evolution in the way that we walk, to the point where footprints of humans are so unique that we can often ascertain that a human-like creature was walking around a certain place at a certain time only from the footprints. This was from a paper that was published in 2017. Trakalos is a site in southern Greece, and what it purported was that this is a hominin, a human-like creature that lived in Europe 6 million years ago. This predates the earliest hominins in Europe by millions and millions of years. This is an extraordinary claim. You don't just, somebody said we found footprints from a hominin in Africa 6 million years ago. It's like, yeah, get them in line. There's a bunch of them. We already know that. So from Europe, this is very controversial. And this paper was the subject of very intense debate. The authors had a lot of difficulty getting it published. It ended up being published in a journal that does not specialize in these types of studies, which means that the peer review level was probably not as rigorous. I got interviewed by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation about what I thought about these prints, and I talked about it on Twitter to the point where the authors started yelling at me on Twitter, and I was like, oh Lord, I don't want to get into this. But the problem was very similar. So here in real scientific practice, we have a problem that's very similar to that. Where are the other prints? Well, we have photos of them. Well, they're not in the paper. Well, we have them. Why aren't they in the paper? Is this available to you? Sorry, did I turn off the mic again? No. Oh, okay. And so this has been a bit of a debate, and I think most people in the field have come to the conclusion that this is probably not a hominin, but it's interesting to see the exact types of thought exercises that you can put into Bigfoot are applicable in the actual scientific research of other types of evidence and specimens. What's going on here? There we go. Shifting gears away from anatomy and talking about other types of biological sciences, one of the things that we have to be considerate of is we're not talking about the existence of just one animal. If we have Bigfoot or Sasquatch in North America, we need to have an entire population of them unless they live for tens of thousands of years, which they don't because animals don't do that. How many of them are there? How many would a population need to have in order to sustain itself over the long haul? And in conservation biology, we talk about what's called the 5,500 rule. In other words, you need 50 individuals to avoid inbreeding, because inbreeding is bad for populations because it reduces genetic variation and it makes catastrophic diseases that are genetic more likely to be expressed in individuals who then do not survive and do not reproduce. And then you need 500 individuals to avoid what's called genetic drift. Genetic drift is a more complicated concept, but essentially what it is, it's a mechanism by which genetic variation is lost from a population due to random chance and what we call stochastic processes. So some animals pass away before they're able to reproduce because they have some sort of injury, they get sick, they get die, and over time evolution weeds them out because they're not well adapted. Other times they fall off a cliff or a boulder falls on them, or some random event happens and they die. And it's not because they weren't adapted, it's because, well, bad things happen. And we have a very good understanding about these processes from bison in North America. And before contact with European settlers, we estimate that there were probably more than 60 million of these bison running around North America. And by 1890, because I guess at some point somebody thought, wow, what a wonderful idea, we'll sit on the back of a railway car and we'll just shoot them and let them rot in the field. Humans can be pretty awful sometimes. There were less than 1,000 bison left in North America. And today, they've rebounded. There's now about 500,000 of them. They're often farmed, which actually has its own problems because you get genetic cross-trading with cows because they're very closely related to them. Those are called beefalo, and they actually are pretty delicious. But we know a lot about what happens to the genetics of a population because of our studies on North American bison and lots of other animals. So if we think about Bigfoot and Sasquatch, we should be able to reconstruct in some part their genetic history from their population genetics. So if we ever get Bigfoot DNA, we should be able to predict that it would show evidence of a bottleneck because their populations almost certainly would not be as large today as they were in the past because you live in Eugene. And wherever there are humans, there's not often room for other large mammals. A few years ago, in 2014, the very legitimate journal Proceedings of the Royal Society of Biological series published this great paper, Genetic Analysis of Hair Samples Attributed to Yeti, Bigfoot, and other, I like the word anomalous primates. Not anomalous, just... Anyway, this was the data table. And what it is different specimens from different parts of the world. India, Bhutan, the Kingdom of Bhutan, Nepal, Russia, Arizona, USA, California, USA, Minnesota, USA. I guess Bigfoot got lost and visited the Midwest. Oregon, USA, Texas, because everything's bigger in Texas, including Bigfoot. Washington State. And so they systematically tested the genetics of every single one of these specimens, and as you can see, the sequence match for them: cow, wolf, coyote, dog, white-tailed deer, cow, human, black bear, porcupine. It's like if you're confusing a porcupine with a primate, you should probably have stopped drinking hours ago. Brown bears, tapirs, polar bears. None of these have withstood any sort of rigorous scientific testing. They have all of the tests on these specimens in terms of their DNA. None of them have come back as no match or not matched primate closest to an orangutan, which is what you would expect if Sasquatch is the descendant of a Gigantopithecus, because Gigantopithecus lived in Asia and would be more closely related to orangs than to chimps or gorillas. It would look fairly like a human, but clearly not. So that's another way to test this. If Bigfoot is descended from Gigantopithecus, then his DNA would be more like those of orangutans than other apes. And it leaves you asking, where are they? And one of the things that always strikes me as I fly over the United States is how packed with people this country is east of the Mississippi, and how not packed with people the rest of the country is. And so you can see this is a wonderful composite image of satellite imagery taken by NASA of this continent at night. And the eastern seaboard, I mean, you can see that metroplex running from Boston to New York City to Philadelphia, straight on down to Washington, D.C. The entire way is totally lit up because that area of the country is thick with humans the entire time, for hundreds of miles. It's just people after people after people. You can see the Midwestern metroplexes. There's Detroit in Michigan, Chicago, Milwaukee on the southwest side of Lake Michigan. But then by about, where you get to Dallas and Texas and then Oklahoma City, it starts to thin out pretty quickly. And that bright series of lights in southern Canada, northern United States, that's actually, that's not human inhabitation lights, those are fires from wells. Yeah, you can see that stuff from space. You want to really freaked out. Look at a map of Asia, and it's like South Korea is an island because North Korea is totally dark. You're like, okay, not going to visit there anytime soon. But anyway, I mean, you can see that on the West Coast, Southern California is pretty heavily populated from San Diego up through LA. And then on the Western Coast, you go from Vancouver to Seattle to Portland. But that's about it. And there's an enormous amount of space in the Western United States that is just, for the most part, unoccupied. And people drive through on roads and on highways, but there are not a whole lot of people living there. I was looking at an interesting map of the population density of Oregon, because today I was asking Dr. Carter's students, where are you from? Are any of you from Portland? Yeah. How many kids were in your high school class? 900. Are any of you from Eastern Oregon? Yeah. How many were in your high school class? 40. So, Eastern Oregon gets very, very thin with people very quickly, and there are giant parts of this state where there just are not that many people living, and that's where we should be looking for any sort of Bigfoot or Sasquatch. So, the moral of the story, wrapping it all up, is that science requires you to be skeptical. You have to think critically about evidence, and you have to consider it from a critical, skeptical frame of mind. But it's also critically important as scientists to keep an open mind and to be receptive to mind-blowing new developments that we would have never anticipated if the evidence supports any sort of, wild observations, wild conclusions. Never would have anticipated the Hobbit. Never would have anticipated Homo naledi, but here we are with the skeletons, indisputably showing that these weird creatures did in fact live on this planet at one point in time. Wrapping up with a reference to another, probably my second favorite TV show. You just gotta go look for the truth because it's out there. If any of you want to engage me on social media, I use Twitter, so that's my handle, so you can follow or chat with me there. But my talk is not over, so if any of you have any questions, I will try to provide answers.